Hello, everybody, and welcome to our series of conversations on women in diplomacy. Together with us today, we have a special guest, the Ambassador of Canada to Italy, Elissa Golberg. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. When I look at you and I look at your country, Canada, Canada is really leading by example when it comes to women in diplomacy and foreign policy. And I also know that you contributed really to the feminist foreign policy adopted by your country. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? So what's the meaning of a feminist foreign policy and what lessons can we learn from you?
So I guess I would say a couple of things. The first is Canada has come a long way, but we're also very humble about how much further we have to go. We also built our experience looking at Sweden. The Swedes were really the first that tried to articulate what was meant by a feminist foreign policy. From a Canadian perspective, it builds on what has been a really long-standing commitment to human rights and gender equality in our foreign policy. But the difference for a feminist foreign policy is that it goes one step further. The idea of a feminist foreign policy is that you're actually seeking not just to advance rights and equality, but that you're seeking transformative change in how the system of policies, programs, and interactions happens. And that's a qualitative shift. It's the idea that everybody everywhere, irrespective of gender, of age, thinking about intersectionality, so geography, where are people coming from, where have they been in their life experiences, that all of that needs to be taken into consideration when you're designing your programs internationally. And so for us, it influences every part of our foreign policy, which is also different. So it's about our political and diplomatic engagement, our advocacy, but it's equally about how we do trade agreements and how we approach economic diplomacy. It's about how we do our consular work, and it's about how we think about peace and security. So it's all of these things coming together externally. It builds on a domestic commitment in Canada as well. So our foreign policy is not somehow distinct from what we have to do in Canada to make sure that we're taking into account inclusion and diversity so that all people are represented, so that all people can participate meaningfully in political, economic, and cultural life. That's another really important part of it for us. And in the Ministry of Global Affairs specifically, it also means a whole bunch of internal change that had to take place over time, right? How were we thinking about how we designed our policies and our practices? So making sure that people understood how to apply what we call a gender-based analysis plus. So not just looking at the interaction between men and women, girls and boys, but also, again, that intersectionality lens. How does age come into perspective? How does race come into perspective? Religious, other factors that define who we are as people, that has to be a part of how we think about policy design. So that's a big change internally. You have to train 11,000 people so that they think about a GBA plus analysis. It also means that how we evaluate our programs and our policies has to change. So how does this idea feed into the development of new policies and practices, and then how are we assessing them? And it's all also related to how we then project ourselves in the world. And this is where we're still working hard at it. Over the last 7 years, yes, now we have parity in terms of ambassadors, for example. There's an equal number of men and women heads of mission overseas. That came both because of policies that had put in place many, many years ago to increase the number of women coming in at junior levels, but it also meant a political commitment from the top. That all things being equal based on merit, there was a need to make sure that our heads of mission abroad reflect broader Canadian society. So at a minimum, that means that you should have representation of both men and women at the highest levels possible for Canada overseas. We're increasingly now making much better strides on representing the diversity of Canadians. If 1 out of 4 Canadians comes from somewhere else in the world, we need to look like that. We need to look like Canadians. So we're also seeing a steady growth in having colleagues of different visible minority status being represented at the head of mission level as well. So that's a whole series of deliberate policies and actions, which at its base is about making sure that everybody everywhere has the chance to have a dignified life, that everyone should have the ability to have access to peace, prosperity, and security, irrespective of gender, irrespective of status.
Indeed. And you mentioned somehow women, peace and security. I mean, this is one of the pillars of feminist foreign policy. In a couple of years, we will celebrate 25 years of the agenda. Where do you see ourselves? So in terms of achievements, but also in terms of steps to move from commitments to real implementation.
Sure. I mean, it is amazing to think about how far we've come. I was a younger diplomat at the time when 1325 was adopted. That was when Canada was on the Security Council. And at that time, it was a radical idea that we would talk about these issues in the context of the most important international peace and security forum in the world, that somehow we needed to make sure that, again, that differentiated experience of conflict and peace was understood, that women and girls experience violence and war differently than men and boys do. Not worse necessarily, but differently. And that lens, that pair of glasses that we have to put on, which is really what a feminist foreign policy is about. It's a pair of glasses that you have to wear when you're designing policies and practices. That's what's changed, I think, most positively on the women, peace and security agenda, that it is much more natural now, not perfect, not every day, all the time, but it's much more natural for policymakers to understand that women and girls experience violence and conflict differently. It's taken us a long way to get here. Canada's put a heavy emphasis on representation. And so for us, a big part of advancing the women, peace and security agenda is who's at the table, who has voice, who's not at the table, and why aren't they at the table? A couple of very specific things for us has been women mediators, for example, making sure that they're part of the process of dialogue. Women members of civil society should be somewhere involved in the process of making decisions about what will peace look like going forward. What does society look like after the violence has stopped? Another piece for us has been looking at policing and militaries. So for peace operations, peacekeeping missions, how do we increase the number of, not just the number, but the meaningful representation of women police and women military in peace operations? And it's not just for the sake of it. We don't do it just because we want women at the table. We do it because we know that if we don't, and the data, we have hard data from lots of different studies and lots of experience over decades, if you don't have strong female representation, then you won't have successful peace agreements. We know that if there aren't women participating in peace missions, you're not necessarily going to have access to certain parts of the society. There will be certain parts of the society that won't feel safe if they're only talking to a male peacekeeper or a male police officer, for example. And usually for peace missions, it's about a transition for a society. It's about trying to encourage and foster more equity going out into the future. And again, they need to see that their police forces and their militaries reflect who they are. But it takes time. I think when we talk about the lessons that we've learned from this, the first lesson is trying to match ambition with reality, right? And I think, it's not always easy to match that level of ambition. There's where we want to be. Yes. And why we want to be there, because we know that societies that are more diverse and more inclusive and more equitable are more successful societies. Yes. That's what we know and what we aspire to. And then there's the reality of getting people there. And that's not easy, right? You're talking about transformational change. You're talking about changing power dynamics, right? So why are some minority groups having stronger influence and access than other minority groups? A feminist foreign policy or a focus on women, peace and security specific to peace operations is trying to undo some of that systemic discrimination. And that is hard. That's the part where this isn't a 5-year agenda. This isn't one program or set of activities that you can put in place. This is about transformational change that takes decades.
Which takes time, indeed. You somehow mentioned how women are contributing to peace and security, to foreign policy, diplomacy. Do you have some specific examples that you want to bring us, also based on your own experience?
Sure. I mean, we've talked a lot about women, peace, and security, and that has been a heavy emphasis for Canada. Again, on the diplomatic and advocacy side, these are issues we've worked on for decades. Canada's been leading the resolution in the UN Human Rights Council on women's human rights for almost 30 years. The shift, again, with a feminist foreign policy, though, was to make sure that it was influencing all of our foreign policy activities. And trade is a really good example. When we introduced the feminist foreign policy in 2017 and taking that GBA plus approach into the ministry, one of the questions that we had with our trade colleagues was initially, well, how will this apply to trade agreements and to negotiating new economic arrangements? And the initial reaction from our colleagues that work on trade issues was, well, it's not a problem. Trade is gender neutral. We always negotiate in the best interests of Canadians. And so we had to peel that back and say, well, who's actually participating in some of these negotiations? Have you looked at the data? Are there particular sectors, for instance, that we're more willing to, if you will, give up in a trade negotiation? And when you unpack, well, who are those that are employed in those sectors? Does it tend to have a disproportionate impact on certain parts of the population? Is it minority groups? Is it women? Is it Indigenous peoples? So what does this mean for how we do trade policy? It doesn't mean that we necessarily will change if that particular trade agreement is advantageous to Canada as an aggregate. But it at least means we understand what the potential negative implications will be for parts of our society. And then we're in a better position to put in place remedies. We could say, okay, so if they're going to be disproportionately impacted, how do we make sure that we have supports in place for that particular sector to transition, for instance? Or how do they get training opportunities, for example? And that's led to all kinds of additional new programs that the government has set up. So the BWIT program, Women Business and Technology program, enabling women and Indigenous people and youth to be able to export internationally, but putting a dedicated focus on that, which wasn't something we did before because we just assumed, well, if you were export ready, anybody could be export ready. But the feminist approach has made us or has helped us to better unpack the choices that we're making in our policies and programs.
And understand the complexity of all these policies.
Exactly.
Of course, connecting all the dots.
Yeah.
And maybe last question on your personal story. I'm very interested also in you as a diplomat. And
nobody
for
ever
instance,
asks diplomats those questions.
I think it's very interesting also to hear about you as, personally exactly. I mean, as a female diplomat. So first of all, I'm interested to know why did you become a diplomat? I know what was your ambition, vision for the future, but also how being a woman has affected your decision or then your career.
So, I mean, as far as working in international affairs was concerned, that was clear from a really, really young age. And I think it also came from my household. So I'm a first-generation Canadian. So my mom was a refugee to Canada. My father was an immigrant to Canada. So a kind of classic immigrant story, right? A household that talked politics, that was very grateful to the country that welcomed us. And so a really strong kind of social justice orientation and a very strong commitment to Canada, whether that was volunteering. That was just how our household was. And certainly initially I thought, well, I was definitely going to go work for an NGO, or I was going to work for the UN or another international organization. And through a variety of happenstance, I did an internship at our Ministry of Global Affairs. And it became very clear that actually I could do all of it. by working in diplomacy, that I could create space for civil society partners and colleagues so that we could work together on policy and programs. I would be working with international organizations, and I would be able to have the honor of representing Canada internationally. And so that was how I came into diplomacy. As far as being a woman in diplomacy, I came in at a time when I was sort of the transitional generation. And here we really have to, I think, thank with immense gratitude the women who came before us, because I'm really part of that first generation of women that came into certainly Canadian diplomacy with the full expectation that as long as everything was based on merit, there was no role that I could not have if I had the capacities to do so. That there were no necessarily obstacles to that on the basis of merit. And that's because of the women who came before us. So my generation is that generation of women that are in senior leadership roles. Before coming here and having the privilege of representing Canada and Italy, I was Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy. So in our organization, that's an incredibly important function. I was responsible for Canadian foreign policy, economic policy, development policy, our work on evaluation, results and delivery, on innovation. Those roles historically were not roles that women had. The roles that women had were human resources or corporate affairs.
Yeah.
And there were a few outstanding women that were, ambassadors, but certainly not at the parity that we have today. So, I came in at a time when we could do that, but it was just starting. And so we all kind of pulled each other up. We would be happy if in a competition, if one of us made it, and then we pulled the rest of us with us. But I was also that generation of first Canadian female ambassador to the UN in Geneva. And we'd had representation going back to the 20s. So the fact that in 2011 I was still a first is quite remarkable. That's only 10 years ago, right? When I was the representative of Canada in Kandahar, I was the first female and only female that ever filled that role. I was also in an environment where I was the only senior female civilian in a military environment. Where I was both a civilian and a woman around a table with generals making decisions, working with my Afghan counterparts, often as the only senior woman at the table. So I'm mindful that I'm still in a place of firsts, but much less so. And really delighted that the generation of women diplomats that are now coming up, there's very few instances now where they're the first. And where they get to be the third and the fourth.
Which is great.
It's great. What we really need to continue to work on is, yes, gender equality, but also inclusion and diversity, right? Making sure, again, that our diplomatic corps represent our societies.
And do you have a message for younger women, who are inspiring to have such a career?
The things that I say to my team is, first of all, pick something that you love to do, obviously, because we spend too much time at work not to love what we do. Bring your passion, but also your pragmatism. Be open. As diplomats, our job is to, in a sense, be anthropologists, right? To understand the places that we are, to reach out, be prepared not just to talk to people that make you comfortable. The most successful diplomats are those who are uncomfortable most of the time, right? Be open to being in the world. Make sure you build networks that are multifaceted. You shouldn't be spending all your day in your office, and you shouldn't be spending all your day only talking to other government officials, right? You really have to get to know the societies that you're in. But for women who want to do this today, it's incredibly rewarding as a career. It's challenging. It will challenge you every day because you have to make tough decisions. sometimes life or death decisions, depending on the role that you occupy. But you can and should consider it as a career.
Ambassador, thank you. Thank you so much for your words. But most of all, I would say thank you for inspiring us and really leading by example.